Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to ask the question and discuss in detail, do heavy lockouts, I don't care whether it's done in a power rack, off of boards, off of pins, off of blocks, whatever you want to do to create a heavy lockout, does it actually overload the triceps? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because, this is something people say a lot in training. They'll say things like, oh yeah, this overloads the triceps. And people just accept that at face value because it's such a popular phrase. But people need to remember that's kind of a bro phrase. That's what it is. It's a bro phrase. It's not really based on reality. Because, when you ask people, well, can you explain to me the mechanism behind this? Now, I know why people started doing heavy lockout work. There's reasons why equipped powerlifters do it. And that's because the lockout on the bench press is what matters to them. Because they have a shirt to help get a couple 100 pounds, if not more, of the weight started out of the bottom, right? That's what they have. In fact, they're wearing bench shirts that when they come down, sometimes they have to row the bar to their chest. Like the weight, like when they have 400 pounds or 500 pounds on the bar, it can't always even touch their chest unless they pull a little bit. So that tells you how tight and how much tension those shirts create. They create hundreds of pounds of force. Now, they have to be learned to use correctly. There's a skill to using a shirt, and sometimes when you get a different shirt, they have to relearn the skill and the bar path and everything else. There's a whole skill associated with using that shirt. So this doesn't automatically add hundreds of pounds, but keep in mind, there are guys, when you start looking at weight classes, where the equipped guy has a 300, 400, and sometimes more bench press over the raw lifter in the same weight class as far as records go. So they add a lot. But you need to understand, all they need to really be able to do in terms of strength is, can they lock out the 700 pounds? Doesn't matter if they can't do 400 off their chest raw, but they need to be able to use the shirt to lock that 700, right? That's what they need to do, and therefore they train the lockout for specificity of training, for a strength curve. That's what they're actually going to produce. But when it comes to actual muscle fiber recruitment, and when you look at it biomechanically, there is no reason to think that there is any more tricep activation by using, I don't know, if you're a 300-pound bencher, if you can lock 500 or 600 pounds on lockouts, there is no actual evidence that would even suggest at a biomechanical level that more tricep gets involved. Now, some people say, yeah, but I've done them and then my triceps cramp and they just throb. And it's like, that's right, because you've worked your triceps at an angle, a joint angle and intensity that they are not used to. But if you went and tried a totally new, really heavy tricep exercise and you tried to push it with maximum poundages, an exercise you've never done before, a function of the tricep you've never done before, your triceps would also throb and hurt. And when we really talk about the irony of it, people are doing this now not because they want to get better at the equipped bench, but they're doing it for, I don't know, to try to build their triceps. And that's really the funny part, because the guy who really made most of this popular and brought it so much into the mainstream, Louis Simmons, who I have listened to and read extensively over the years, has even said, the tricep work we're doing, this is what we're trying to do. A bodybuilder would never do this. And a bodybuilder shouldn't do this. I've heard him say that. A lot of their tricep stuff, because he says we are focused upon the lateral and the medial head of the tricep, whereas in this long head encompasses the biggest chunk of the meat, but the long head is not really involved as a primary mover in the bench press with a shirt. So therefore, if it doesn't get stronger and doesn't develop in any real meaningful way, it's no big loss. But you need those other two heads to be maximized. And so all of their tricep work focuses on those two heads, which are the smaller of the three heads of the tricep. So the irony there is that if a person was trying to maximize tricep development, the exercises that are associated with all of this, the entire exercise selection that's associated with, say, West Side, which includes enormous amounts of these partials, you wouldn't want to do what they do, because they aren't maximizing tricep development. They're not concerned with recruiting all the muscle fibers through the tricep. They only care about the muscle fibers that are directly involved in the top half of the bench press. Well, that's an interesting thing to think about, because the entire tricep isn't involved. And that's one thing that you have to remember when you start dealing with partials, and particularly partials that take an entire function of the muscle out. Right? What happens when you do that? You reduce the potential for muscle fiber recruitment. So actually, it isn't even biomechanically possible to recruit every muscle fiber through the tricep on a lockout. Even if that lockout is double what your max bench is in terms of weight, it is not biologically or biomechanically possible to recruit every muscle fiber in the entire tricep doing that. So when someone says they're overloading the triceps, it's like, but you're doing an exercise that can't even work all the regions or all the muscle fibers of the tricep. Even the other two heads you're trying to work, there are fibers in there that are only activated at the bottom. And just like the long head, there are fibers in the long head that are only activated when your shoulder is back here. Which is why, again, people, when they isolate, if they're not doing it just for powerlifting but for size, they're recommended to do a tricep extension to where you have movement of the shoulder here, right? You have some shoulder rotation happening. That's why pull-ups and chin-ups, if you go all the way to stretch at the bottom, leave this part of your tricep sore, that long head, because they get worked. And so that head gets almost no work on any lockout. And there are even fibers in the other heads that are only activated when you're stretched at the bottom. Because here's what you have to remember. Heavy lockout work completely negates any stretch position of the tricep. Well, you have to remember that in any given muscle, you have muscles, even in a simple muscle like the tricep, 3 heads. It's not a complex muscle. Even with a muscle like that, you have muscle fibers that work through the entire range of motion. They can recruit at any point, and you have muscle fibers that are only activated at certain joint angles. So in other words, you really need the entire range of motion if you wanted to maximally overload the triceps. And I would assume overload meaning actually recruit muscle fibers, right? That's what we would be talking about. And what you have to remember, when you can lift a heavier weight through a shorter range of motion, what does that tell you? It's not possible for you to be recruiting more muscle fibers. The reason you can lift more weight through a shorter range of motion is because you're at a mechanical advantage and it's easier, right? I want people to think about it. It's easier. And this is where people get confused. They're not understanding how muscles work when they say things like, yeah, but I can do a lot more weight at the top, so therefore I must be recruiting different muscle fibers. No, you're not. Because what you're doing is you're at that position to where it's easier to lift more weight, just like you think of a jack and a lever. Well, you know, at the lockout, look at the angles. There's less going on with your moment arms. Therefore, it is easier. The muscles don't have to work as hard to move a heavier weight. And the reason the lockout feels heavy sometimes is not because... how do I put this so that I don't get tongue-tied here? When you fail at the lockout, it's because you've exhausted the muscle itself in its entirety. You're always stronger at the lockout. That's why if you're a 300-pound bencher, you can do rack lockouts of 500 pounds. All right, you already know that you're strong enough to lift 500 pounds through that range of motion fresh, don't you? The reason it gets hard when you're a 300 bencher and you get stuck with 310 is because you're exhausting the muscles involved early on in the rep, and therefore the muscles don't have anything left. You've exceeded which are the muscle fibers that can actually help you the whole range of motion. You've exhausted those, and now you're relying on just the ones that do the lockout, and they're probably exhausted from getting the weight moving also. So basically, by doing a full range of motion, even with a lighter weight, you actually overload the triceps more to the point to where they can't lock even a lighter weight anymore, because you've exhausted and overloaded the tricep and the pecs and everything else. You've overloaded them by using the entire range of motion with too much weight or too many reps with the same weight, and they can no longer recruit enough muscle fibers because they've been overloaded and exhausted, right? They've been taken to momentary fatigue. They can't produce enough force anymore because you've hit them too hard. And if you're just doing the top half with a heavier weight, obviously you can do a heavier weight because you haven't exhausted them at the joint angles to where they're disadvantaged. And it's that lighter weight at the disadvantaged position that works the muscle extremely hard. So in other words, you actually recruit more muscle fibers if you were to hit a 1 rep max, or let's say you hit an 8 rep max and you hit muscle failure. You've actually exhausted more muscle fibers through the tricep if you use the full range of motion versus if you did muscle failure with even 200 pounds heavier with the same number of reps at the top, right? you can't even get to all the muscle fibers doing it that way. You will actually have overloaded and exhausted more muscle fibers by doing the longer range of motion. So if anything, this whole concept of overloading at the lockout, actually it's creating less overload. You created less tension on the muscle. It actually doesn't recruit as many muscle fibers. So maybe we should call it underloading instead of overloading. That would technically be a better phrase. Use a heavier weight to underload the muscle so you don't work it as hard, because that's actually what's happening. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.